Can't guess, I'll tell you the author at the end. There is only one country in the Arab world that has been classified as free. That nation is Tunisia. Jordan, Morocco, and Kuwait come second with a classification of partly free. The rest of the countries in the Arab world are classified as not free. People living in these countries are either uninformed or misinformed. They are unable to adequately address, much less publicly discuss, matters that affect the region and their day-to-day lives. A state-run narrative dominates the public psyche, and while many do not believe it, a large majority of the population falls victim to this false narrative. Sadly, this situation is unlikely to change. The Arab world was ripe with hope during the spring of 2011. Journalists, academics, and the general population were brimming with expectations of a bright and free Arab society within their respective countries. They expected to be emancipated from the hegemony of their governments and the consistent interventions and censorship of information. These expectations were quickly shattered. These societies either fell back to the old status quo or faced even harsher conditions than before. In contrast to that was the response of the world community, and most especially of the local community at large in the city of Pittsburgh after the horrific massacre at Tree of Life Synagogue. That's a synagogue I have known and at which I've attended services several times, and at which on one occasion I was even asked to do part of the Torah reading, the weekly reading from the Bible that is part of every Sabbath service. Last Friday, a week ago today, the eve of the first Sabbath after the Sabbath massacre, the local newspaper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, had the following front page headline. This is in Hebrew, across something I've never seen or heard of having been done before, or certainly since. The words of the Hebrew, or rather technically Aramaic words of the Kaddish, the traditional Jewish memorial prayer, Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah. These are the first words of the Jewish mourner's prayer, magnified and sanctified be your name, to be recited that Sabbath, a week ago tonight, the first since the tragedy at Tree of Life. At which point they also developed the following prayer, from which I'll read just a few short excerpts. As we face the venomous hate that extinguishes lives, we are filled with anger, with shock, and with despair. We mourn the murder of precious human beings, our brothers and sisters who were gathered for prayer, for tradition, and for community. You should know, by the way, this is a city where the Jewish community and the larger Pittsburgh community, it's a city of about 1.5 million urban population, very much stick together and are devoted to each other. We mourn with those who love the victims, and we offer our love as you love your people Israel and all the world. We pray for the wounded of body and soul. Oh God, please grant them healing, physical and spiritual. Jews were murdered, but all America has been assaulted. And finally, thoughts on the coming holiday celebrating the day on a somewhat lighter vein, celebrating the day Americans fed undocumented aliens from Europe. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much.
Sit up here with me.
Okay. Again.
Very good, Joe. Very good.
You like this?
Yes, absolutely.
Appropriate that I put in the...
We're at the merciful end of a long day of talk, and I want to bring everything together and maybe just cover some points that we had today. I am sitting with the journalism professor, the greatest critic of my articulation up here, so I want to be sure that I'm succinct and eloquent in my delivery. But in any case, we began the day trying to understand what truth is. My friend here, Uchenna, said, what is real? Reality is seen through each individual's eyes. That's the truth to a lot of folks. In past times, we would look for truth from people such as Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather. We trusted those folks implicitly to give us the real deal, and we didn't really think that they were giving us what we called fake news. This is a concept that's probably been out there since the beginning of time, as we heard. Somebody mentioned the War of the Worlds broadcast, where people who weren't tuned into that broadcast found out that this was all fake. We didn't use that terminology, but it scared a lot of folks. Perhaps, as another gentleman said here, the pamphleteers of the American Revolutionary period, who also actually carried that sort of stuff out in other parts of the world, in Europe, created a certain buzz. We would call it buzz today, but it led to violence, a lot of violence. So truth comes from a lot of different places. The question is, what is the truth? The problem today is that we don't have a set coterie of media. Our media today is everybody. Anybody who has a phone in their hands is really media. They can take photographs, they can run a video starring themselves, can do a newscast from wherever they are. And as a result, we are finding a very large change in values and attitudes. People are discounting scientific research. As you can see, there's a lot of folks out there who have fallen victim or fallen prey to the fact that, oh, even though science proves it, how do I know science is telling the truth? And they fall back on things. I'll do a little tangent here. We have a movie out now called First Man, and that's about the first landing on the moon in 50 years ago next year, and it has reignited a lot of the arguments that were raised back in the 60s and 70s that we never really landed on the moon because it's not possible to land on the moon because of the Van Allen radiation belt. No spacecraft could go through there, and the astronauts come back safely and healthy, and most of our missions are what they call low Earth orbit inside of that. So a lot of perceptions that people have are based on things that they seem to feel are logical and are based in science, but we also have another issue. Evidence-based policies of governments are not really exactly evidence-based policies according to some folks. This leads to a lack of rational discourse on issues, and at the same time, we also have seen in the last 48 hours where news can be constructed, where you can take a video and you can alter that video, as we saw with the Acosta video, where there's some concern that the Acosta video now was treated by Alex Jones and InfoWars and treated in some fashion to make it appear that this would look sympathetic to Trump and the reason why he asked this guy to have his badge removed. We also are living in a world where AI, artificial intelligence, is collecting a lot of stuff on us. I know that I work from home, and when my wife is working at home with me and she says, we're talking about a certain type of dinner, let's go to this restaurant, within 20 minutes she says her Facebook feed is featuring coupons from different Italian restaurants, let's say. So she's wondering, if this is really, and she says to me, you gotta know, man, this is what's going on. The computer is collecting your data. And I wonder, because if you put in the search feed, and let's say you're taking a trip and you're deciding you want to go to Japan, for the next 3 weeks you'll get all sorts of ads and emails about, oh, we're a specialist in trips to Asia, or this airline, Air Nippon or Japan Airlines is offering it. So you have to wonder. The other thing too with AI is that there could be a governmental control of your access to information as well as services. What was mentioned, I found very, very interesting, was that China now is collecting a lot of data from people on the streets in the cities and in the countryside. They're looking at the way people walk, they're looking at the way people access information, and they have what they now call a social score. And depending on how your social score comes out, they are then deciding whether or not you should be able to be eligible for certain services or assistance. The other thing too is we have a situation now which was kind of brought out where emotional or striking or violent content seems to draw people in. And oftentimes, as I think I was saying to you that, no, I was actually saying it to the other guy. A couple weeks ago, I was looking at an article on the feed for HuffPost. I got to the bottom, and there was a picture of Obama, and his hair was white with a white beard, and there was a click on it to see about an article. I clicked on it, and it was absolutely nothing about him. It happened to do something else, which is what they call clickbait. They bait you into clicking on something, and then you get there and you realize this is nonsense. And I started reading the article. I said, oh, this is garbage, and I got off. But those clickbait things are set up so people will start to look at those things, and you don't have to kind of in the initial go-round get 100 people. You get one person, and then he says to somebody, and it becomes geographic, geometric, and then people then start to assume that maybe this is true. We have another situation. Office seekers now openly tout partisan views because they know their media is going out to 1 million different folks through different channels. So what you have is people will be basically pushed into office, and then they don't have to respond to the constituents that they represent. So if you have a congressman who served in the office for 30 years, 20 years, 15 years, and he is representing a specific district in New York, we find he's more often more responsive to national groups than he is to his local constituents, whether it's in Brooklyn or Queens or Manhattan. The scientific method, which was something we relied on in the past, has become a little bit frayed. And if we continue to show disdain towards methodologies and things that we've had over the past years and centuries as basis for truth, if we start to continually fray those, we're going to be in a very, very negative situation, and we're going to be we're going to have a lot of problems. Another thing too is that we have a situation where this irrational discussion, when a rational individual such as a journalist goes in there to try to set things straight, he or she is putting themselves in a situation of danger. And as George was saying a couple weeks ago, we have journalists all over the world that are either being killed, disappeared, thrown in jail, or basically made a mockery of, and they lose their credibility because we want a certain narrative to be pushed. And when these folks challenge that narrative now, there are so many different and more perverse ways for us to be able to make them look like they're not telling the truth. In fact, international organizations, because of the situation with media, we're now forced to bring in people to get us to a point where we are getting a big splash. So when we have an issue at the UN or at the World Bank, we bring in a celebrity, and we use that celebrity to drive the campaign. And although the campaign is based in fact, we're finding that more and more people are following the issue, not because of the merits of the issue or the concern they have, but they're more concerned with the fact that here's a celebrity. So we have, Angelina Jolie going out and running around the world as an ambassador, but people really do not know the full extent of the cause that they're oh, Angelina said, donate $10, so I'm donating $10, and I'm going to change the world, which is far short of the goals of a lot of these campaigns. What else? Well, this weekend we're going to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. We thought that war, those folks thought that war was going to be the last of the major wars. Weren't they wrong? And now we're sitting in a situation since World War II where we haven't had a major international war, but we've had a series of serious conflicts that are regional. We have those obviously in the Middle East. We obviously, the general here was speaking about a situation in the Congo, which was very, very well laid out by people earlier today. And we don't really need to have a hot world war for the world to be in turmoil, obviously. And with all these different regional conflicts, and many of them still are being used as proxy wars by great powers, so we have a situation in which we are a very unstable world where wars are going on, and at the same time, the truth about the situations are not getting out, and we're feeding people a lot of negative information. So we're in a situation where people will buy into sending soldiers to a place without really understanding the consequences or the gravity of that situation. Those four principles are accuracy, humanity, transparency, and accountability. Those are the four principles that people in the past who were journalists worked on. I can't say, nor could she, that everybody is following those four principles when they produce journalistic material now. The other thing is the image of countries in the world outside the U.S., foreign countries. Sometimes the image that they have is a skewed image. As we know in Africa, oftentimes the image of African countries is that of disease, war, poverty, when in reality that may not be the case. The other thing too is that we are in a situation where people here are purchasing and basically grabbing resources from Africa that really should remain in Africa and be utilized for the development of that place, and that is not happening.
Repatriation.
We had a guest speak to us right after lunch about the prevention of genocide, and the efforts to prevent genocide are emanating from the UN, and those programs and those projects and those units of peacekeepers are only as good as the member states want them to be. So whatever the member states state are the goals of that particular program or that peacekeeping team are what's going to happen, and they can also control how successful that peacekeeping team is based on how much resources are allocated to that team. The UN is trying to make a very progressive effort to stem the tide of genocide by going out and applying these 14 principles which are on their website and trying to control some of the negativity and the bad blood between groups that lead to these genocidal conflicts. But they're not always successful because, again, they are dependent upon the member states and what those member states want. And again, because these are political issues, and in many cases, the member states oftentimes will utilize a genocidal conflict to their own ends. We had an interesting discussion about Srebrenica. A survivor of Srebrenica came in and explained to us the history of Srebrenica, and he also explained to us about Yugoslavia. And post-World War II, Tito ran that country with basically a strong hand. It wasn't a communist country per se, but he said it was a socialist country. At the same time, once he died, a lot of the ethnic conflicts that had been basically kept down during his period of time started to reappear, and that led to the crisis in the Balkans in '92. So at the end of this day, I would say that we are still probably somewhat more confused about truth. We still don't really understand what truth is. We've heard a lot of different people talk about truth. I know that, we all have a certain understanding of what truth is based on where we're coming from. I think that one of the things I learned today that was really interesting to me was in a lot of these conflicts where there's truth and people say this side is not truthful. I think it goes back to what my father told me when I was about 15 years old. He said to me, the world is black and white, but it's mostly gray. It's a mix of the two. And he always told me when I was a youngster, he said, when you tell me a story, it's like a loaf of bread. I can cut it in half, throw one half away, and then maybe in that second half, in the very, very center of that second half of a loaf of bread, I'll find a kernel of the truth. So unfortunately, we are in a situation right now where we're very, very much concerned about the direction particularly countries are taking. We're seeing that in Europe there's a high level of xenophobia and nativism. But we're being told that that's not really xenophobia and nativism, it's just us protecting our own countries and worrying about our own citizens. At the same time, I think that we really need to be concerned as journalists, as practitioners in the international sphere, that this is not something we want to continue. And we gotta basically hope that people come to their senses. At this point, if there's any questions or comments people want to make, I'm more than willing to listen to that.
The nature abhors a vacuum, and I think
That's the only thing.
sort of our media space is the same way. It abhors a vacuum, and so there's always a rush to fill it in. So when something happens, or when there's an issue out there, if we're not providing good information, then we're going to get bad information,
Oh, yeah.
and that's part of the problem.
Well,
It's so easy now. It used to be there was a filter, there was a gatekeeper.
Yeah, yeah.
And the gatekeeper function was, I think, maybe people didn't appreciate just how important that function was when media performed that. And now that that's sort of gone away a lot, or been diminished, you know, it's a problem.
A lot of our media sources now have migrated to the internet. And when I was growing up in New York, you could go to a newsstand, there was 4 or 5 newspapers. There was, every week, there was Lifetime, Look magazine. Those things have all migrated, and they're on a very, very infrequent schedule. We don't, you know, if you do subscribe to a flow, such as that woman or myself, I have 4 or 5 newspapers I get from around the world. And when I'm looking at these things and somebody's leaning over the shoulder on a subway train, it's like, oh, why are you reading this newspaper? You're here, why would you want to read the South China Morning Post? Or why would you want to read a newspaper like The Guardian? All they do is give a leftist view of the world. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I read the Wall Street Journal too, and they ain't exactly running to be progressive either. So I think you're right. When there is an empty space, people will fill it, and sometimes they fill it with nonsense, but sometimes with very dangerous stuff. I think that also the fact that, to me, people are not doing that research, that hard research. When somebody comes to me and says to me, well, we got a caravan of 8,000 people, and I'm dispatching 15 to 20,000 troops. Oh yeah, oh, okay, good. That's a good idea because they're going to come over the border. I mean, do you not say to yourself, what's the logic behind this? I mean, here's a general who's a minister, and he thought, oh, I heard it was 100,000 people in a caravan. But people are less willing to challenge these statements that come out, and even on both sides. For example, in the Congo, because I've worked with those folks, we hear, oh, the general of the government and President Kabila said it's the rebels that are causing all this rape. Oh, it's Rwanda, or it's this country, it's that country. I mean, get out there and try to see if you can find some sources and prove things. Obviously, some people, because it's on the other side of the world, will say to you, well, how do I know it's not? This summer, for example, 2 UN investigators were killed in the Congo. They were European and American. And somebody said to me, oh, they were killed by the government. So somebody said to me, well, how do we know this? And he said, well, the caliber of bullets that were found when they did the autopsy are government bullets. Well, how do we know that the rebels didn't get a hand to those bullets and shoot them? And I said at the end, at that point, I said, they're dead. We don't know what they had in terms of information, and who would benefit more from their death? Would it be the government or would it be the rebels? There is a point where you have to start to say to yourself, I don't have enough information to say conclusively 100% that this issue is A or it's B. But I try to make my judgments based on my experience, my education, my knowledge, and say to myself, well, based on what I know and based on the history of this area, I have to go with either A or B. And then you leave it like that. But to just say, well, Donald Trump says I'm sending 10,000 troops because they're coming across the border, and then you got militias running down here. I don't know. And you're right. Safe spaces are not there, and empty spaces are going to be filled with charlatans. Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. It seems to me that if you have a situation where news sources are almost limitless and many of them are skewed, then it falls ultimately upon our nation's educational system, which God knows has its faults, and which you, having been on the committee, know, on which my pet peeve is that they don't teach geography schools in this country anymore, and they teach history in such a way that it's invariably the most hated subject. It therefore is incumbent upon the consumer of news and the consumer of information to educate himself or herself sufficiently to be able to legitimately judge the truth, or at least to be able to judge that something has as you say, a kernel of truth, or has some credibility. And therefore, it's a burden upon the consumer of information. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll just respond to that. A couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, I was invited to see a film about the situation in Colombia. You know that the FARC, the guerrillas, have signed this peace accord, and that after the peace accord was signed, the next president really wasn't feeling the peace accord, and he wanted to kind of change it and go back. People are very, very upset with the terms of the peace accord. They felt they were too generous to the rebels, and you know, I went home that evening and I said, I want to find out a little bit more. I had been to Colombia twice, and I was there during the 80s when there was a period of quelling of this war. There was a period during a presidency of a guy named Betancourt. He signed a temporary ceasefire with the rebels, and that's when I visited Colombia for the first time. But since then, you know, things have gotten heated on and off. And so I spent some time on the line looking at these articles, and I picked up newspaper articles. I started with Wikipedia, which I also was going to say, when you talk about education, everybody decries Wikipedia as garbage, which is not true. I don't think you can base a dissertation on Wikipedia, but I think it's an obviously good source to start from, to pick. And after about 4.5 hours of doing all this research and reading, I'm still even more confused now than before I started the research. And I realized, just like in the Congo, you had rebels, you had the army and the government. The government sponsored right-wing squads who were involved in the drug trade. Well, what were the rebels doing to finance it? They were in the drug trade too. So I'm starting to wonder, well, maybe the government didn't like this peace accord because the right-wingers and the government weren't making their cut from the drug trade too, which is still going on down there. So you know, as you said, you have to get to a point though where you have to say there's a little bit of balance. And in these violent conflicts in the world, Balkans, the Rohingya, Sri Lanka, which nobody mentioned today, which was a horrible situation for many years, excesses are taken on both sides. You know, I go back when I think about 1947, when I was in school, we learned about India, and when India and Pakistan formed, the idea, the British, the genius idea was let everybody who wants to go one place, and the other people go back to the other place, and we have all these situations of violence in the world. So, you know, it comes to a point where you have to say to yourself, you know, the violence is not doing us any good, but at the same time, we're sitting with situations where what is the truth out there of these causes? I wanted to take his question and then I'll take yours. Go ahead.
So, George's comment about consumers have to be educated. I think that was the case even before this.
Yeah.
That the idea isn't that we either read something or listen to something and accept it with whole cloth. One of the problems now is that people who used to be gatekeepers in many cases are just spewing a political point of view rather than news. We've got media and we've got journalism. They're not necessarily the same thing.
Good point.
The audience is gradually moving to the web, and we've got this mix of citizen journalists who haven't been, I mean, if we're going to have citizen journalism, then we need to train those people exactly what journalism is. It isn't just opinion. It's trying to find out exactly what happened. And in terms of you exploring the situation in Colombia, most of these issues are very complex. And if you don't come from with a political bias, you'll find yourself being as confused about almost every one of those issues.
Absolutely. The narrative that's pushed by Western media of Rwanda about the Hutus and the Tutsi, and this is how it went. And then we have other issues. I mean, one of the things I was explaining to somebody earlier today is that Congo sits in an area of Africa called the Great Lakes region. You have Congo, you have Uganda, you have Rwanda, you have Burundi, and all of these countries in this area of Africa are all in turmoil all the time. I mean, you have a situation in Rwanda where you have a president who's Kagame, who's touted as a hero because he quelled everything. Everything is cool. The cleanest country in Africa. Somebody said to me, oh, I was told it's the Switzerland of Africa. And then when you look at the country, oh, I have 50% of my parliament, of my legislature is women. I don't allow plastic bags on the streets of Kigali because we want to keep the pollution down. Yet at the same time, when I listen to this, I say to him, but you have no opposition in your country. Oh, there's no opposition because people are happy with what I'm doing. And that's what I've heard. I'm not saying that
You spoke to Kagame?
No, I didn't speak to Kagame. I spoke to a representative of the government at the UN at a meeting. I said, your country is very, very peaceful. Oh, yeah, because there's no opposition. I said,
Okay.
why is there no opposition? Because people are happy with what Kagame
I've met him several times, but I haven't talked to him at that.
is maybe not telling the whole truth. I still can listen to him. I can still accept him as a colleague. I can still understand him. It doesn't mean, though, that I'm going to accept everything he says and say, oh, yeah, man, you're right. Switzerland of Africa. Gotta be, baby.
All right. You want to, okay.
No.
All right. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. And for really wrapping it up so well. I want to thank everyone who actually spent some time with us, and even some other people who left, and some who were supposed to come and for some reason did not come. You know, this conference, this is 7th year and we're doing it. Most of the other years we've done it in Rutgers in Newark. So we said, okay, let's also bring it to New York. So this is the first time we're doing it in New York. And I want to assure you that we'll continue this discussion, and we'll continue to stimulate dialogue. I've really enjoyed myself learning from a lot of experts and some viewpoints. It's very, very interesting and stimulating. And I believe that we reach wider audiences actually, because some of the things we have done here, we'll try to publish it and report in different media platforms. And this issue about the truth and how it affects our lives actually, we're going to continue this, especially CMPR will have a platform at the United Nations Commission on Social Development in February. We'll discuss that as well as also part of it, how it involves women in March at during the CSW, you know, 6th session of Commission on the Status of Women. So I'd like to invite every one of us to continue this conversation, and we'll try to reach out to everyone who came here with some of these interesting documents and some information we shared today, because everything that was said today is recorded, and we also try to put everything like in a book form as well, just like we did last year, so we can share it across so that everyone can see it and at least ruminate over what we have discussed today. So on behalf of the steering committee for this conference, George, Bob, and of course my friend Robert, and Jeff, it's been a while, so I'm happy you're here. And Chidima also, thank you for coming. And Dr. Shallow, she came all the way from Texas, so we're happy to have you here. Wow. You know, and of course the minister has left, so I really want to thank everyone, and especially also the ambassador here, even though for some reason he didn't come, the ambassador of African Union, you know. So I also want to extend my thanks to him for also making it possible for us to come here as well and stay here. That has been very helpful to us as well. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.